Do I eat the guacamole that has traveled all the way from Africa? These are a lot of hard questions that we need to be pondering over when it comes to food and kind of choices we want to make for our bodies.
Greetings, Earthlings, and welcome back to Earthlings 2.0, the show where we imagine how we can be better versions of ourselves and build a collective future we actually want to live in. If you listen to our Life at 3C episode, still our most popular one yet, you all must like doom scrolling. You'll recall that experts expect a warmer planet to make it more difficult to grow food. Now, depending on the location and what transpires with climate change, temperatures, rainfall, water that's available, increased pests and disease, it's hard to predict what's going to happen. And with some of the most extreme predictions, we could lose all of our pollinators or entire ecosystems could collapse. We're not quite there yet, but a warming planet is the new reality. So that's why we're going to explore this topic more deeply to understand how agriculture is already changing and how it might adapt in the future. But before we beam up our guest on our proverbial spaceship, I'm your host, Lisa Ann Pinkerton. I'm CEO of the award-winning PR firm Technica Communications and the founder of Women in Clean Tech and Sustainability. Before building those organizations, I was an award-winning environmental science reporter for NPR and PBS. And whether this is your first or 50th time tuning in, we encourage you to follow us on social media and leave us a review of what you think about the show. Also, if you could please take a visit to our Patreon page, you can support the show financially and also take our listener survey. Let us know what you think of the show and topics you'd like us to address. Speaking of Patreon, this conversation ran very long. We got really deep and philosophical towards the end. So if you want to hear the whole conversation, go over to Patreon, become a member, and you can download the full version. And thank you to Resource Labs for having us on the network. Our away mission today is at the front lines of our food system, agriculture. This industry and the farmers that comprise it are using technology and improvements to growing practices to increase the efficiency, productivity, and sustainability in food production. At least we think so, or we hope so. To get our heads around this evolution in our food system, we found someone who is uniquely positioned to help us navigate this complex terrain. His name is Venky Ramachandran, and he's the mind behind Agribusiness Matters. That's an analyst firm focused on the future of Agritech. The firm and its very popular newsletter serve to elevate the digital transformation that's happening within food and agricultural systems worldwide in the age of runaway climate change. We caught up with Venky from his home in Hyderabad, India, and we kicked off our conversation around how he got started writing this newsletter.
I have about 37,000 subscribers right now. And a good chunk of them are paid subscribers. And of course, and right now it's being read in about 95 countries. So it's a fairly global newsletter. The audience go as wide as areas in Africa and Northern Africa, and I also have a good active reader base in Latin America. I've also done some projects in Guatemala, Colombia. So and it's very interesting to always to see how different regions, what they pick up, what are the things that they are excited to talk about. So it gives me some kind of a radar of how a very personalized radar of how the agri-tech landscape is kind of evolving in different parts of the world.
Yeah. So what are you sensing how agriculture is evolving in different parts of the world? What are you hearing from your readers?
Well, I mean, there's no one narrative there. Obviously, we are all, each of the countries have their own context. They have their own, sort of political landscape, their own historical context. Of course, few countries are ahead. Few countries are ahead in terms of technological innovation, right? Like, for instance, what we use in the tractors in India is very much outdated if you sort of extrapolate it into the US context right now. But at the same time, what we are doing in financial services in India is far ahead than in US. So now we have this, and the amount of extent of digitization that has happened in India exceeds what the digitization of farms you see in America. So there's a lot of interesting contrast of thoughts.
And I see a lot of agritech businesses vying for a farmer's attention, whether it's electric tractors or robots that analyze a plant's health, or these concepts like regenerative farming or using CRISPR to engineer plants to signal, what they need in terms of nutrients. And so I'm wondering, from your perspective, where do you think farmers should be putting their attention?
Actually, farmers are very clear and sorted. That's what my understanding is, right? Because they know they are in touch with the ground reality, right? I mean, literally, and so they are, and literally and metaphorically. So they are fairly clear about what they want from technology. But of course, as entrepreneurs and as people who have newer technologies, you're always excited. And so you tend to overestimate the potential of the technology and underestimate the complexity of your real landscape, right? So that often plays out in kind of strange and funny ways. So there are a lot of potential. I'm not saying, again, I'm not dismissing any of the potential here, right? We have self-propelling sprayer being discovered and explored right now in chili fields in the country right now. Right? Chile has a lot of. In India, we have a huge labor problem. Of course, it's a global phenomenon as well. But in a country like India, where in various parts of this country there is a massive labor problem, and so one better way to deal with this is to use mechanization effectively. So people are using drones for spraying. People are sort of navigating satellite data to keep track of their cropping patterns, keep track of their weather patterns, right? So in every new season, there is a way to change and adapt the technologies there. So I think, of course, when I say they are sorted, they are also battling a huge amount of uncertainty with respect to climate change, with respect to, extremely volatile market landscape. So, I mean, the kind of market volatility they deal with is actually insane. I keep saying this often that, in a standard rules of the world, right? Anyone who takes the maximum number of risks should be rewarded the most, right? That's how traditional business world operates in. But the funny thing is, farmers are the only set of people who take maximum number of risk, but they're still not adequately rewarded. We haven't designed a system yet that rewards them adequately enough for the kind of risk they take. And I think so that's where a work in progress is there, in terms of how do we design these systems, so that they feel that they're compensated enough for the kind of risk that they take, and they also feel motivated to pursue their kind of lifestyle there. Because at the end of the day, farming is more a lifestyle than business, at least in this part of the world, right? While that might have gone through a sea change in say in America or in other countries, in India it is still a lifestyle, and there is a certain sense of reverence to it. There's a certain sense of sacredness to it.
It illustrates something that we may overlook in terms of farmers are at the whim of so many different variables that are outside of their control. I mean, the weather alone and the rainfall and when it comes and how much, whether or not the price of the food that they're growing is going to be at a level where it's worth harvesting when it's finally ready. That's a problem we have in the United States. And I can understand how farmers would be reticent to adopt everything under the sun, because you only have so many growing seasons in your lifetime, and you want to make sure that you're going to get the yield that you're looking for to be able to continue farming
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
year over year, right? So you don't want to take too many risks. So like you said, you're already taking so many risks that most people probably don't even have a concept of, just in the nature of the work. From your perspective, you mentioned climate change. What do you see as some of the most crucial changes that we'll see in agriculture practices as the planet warms? I mean, are you watching farmers now make adjustments to some of these warming temperatures?
So in mango cultivation, the yields have come down there. So fewer varieties, so we had, of course, because of that, there's yield loss there, the amount of produce that comes to the market gets varied there. And now there is much more variability even in the rains there. So oftentimes, we see that the traditional crop planning models are don't seem to be working in well. So there is, of course, rain is a localized phenomenon, right? So we still, farmers do make some kind of predictions and based on the data that they have, but we are seeing a lot more variability now when compared to the earlier days there. And of course, which there's also a question of, with the kind of amount of variability there, do they have the right set of insurance? Or do they have the right set of ways to deal with it? And so now they are figuring out alternative ways in which how they can respond better to the environment there. Yeah.
Yeah. And are you seeing that in other regions of the world too? Adjustments in yields being lower and farmers adjusting for that?
Yeah. There, it's a pretty much a global phenomenon there. In India, we see rice yields coming down. We see rice yields cotton thing, for instance, the classic instance. Cotton, the amount of production the figures have come down so drastically that now farmers are shifting from cotton to paddy. And we were a country that was the world's largest producer of cotton. We were exporting cotton to Britain, and that's one of the reasons where Britain, sort of colonized India back in the day. But now, if you look at the 2023 numbers for cotton production, they're so low. And of course, there is a lot of various factors there. I'm not just claiming climate change per se. There is a lot of institutional policy failures that have happened. But we see that there are certain commodities that are far more vulnerable.
When I was reading some of your pieces, you talked about this political battle between treating nature as a machine versus an organism. And I was hoping that you could explain these two perspectives for our listeners because I think it's a really fascinating concept.
Yeah, there's always seems to be a conflict between two paradigms. One is of the paradigm of seeing nature as nature as a factory in some sense, right? Farm as a factory, right? And where nature becomes a machine of sorts, where you kind of see that what are the variables that I can optimize further so that I can get what I want, right? And the other counteractive paradigm is that of treating nature in a slightly more reverential way and slightly more way of understanding that, like, perhaps there are so many variables that we don't understand. So we better mimic what nature is doing very well. And this is also an evolutionary perspective, right? Like, for instance, natural selection as a process has optimized a geophysical process like photosynthesis for several millions of years. So, and so if it has been optimized for that kind of a process, you don't want to tinker that too much. You don't want to change few variables without understanding what are the trade-offs that you might end up incurring in. So this kind of paradigm sort of conflict, to put it in a more dramatic way, this sort of battle of paradigms between treating nature as a machine and treating nature as an organism has been playing out in various forms and shapes, in the technologies we choose, in the cropping patterns we choose, in the way we grow our food, in the way we market the food. And I think this battle is going to be there for long. There's no one solution for this battle, right? And of course, there's no one particular answer there, right? We can't do blind mimicry of what nature does, because nature didn't evolve for us. Nature evolved for its own self-propagation, right? And at the same time, we can't keep tweaking these machines as if it were a machine, and as if we understand all the variables and out there, all the levers out there. We are still discovering. We still don't have a freaking clue of how the soil really works. Right? We are still discovering so many aspects. It's very funny, right? Like, soil is everywhere, but we still don't really understand what constitutes a healthy soil. We are still discovering so many microbial fungi networks, and we still really don't understand. I mean, you really go to the depth of it, there's so much we don't know. So when we don't know so much, then the question comes that to what extent can you tweak it and play with it? I mean, I write largely for decision makers. I don't write for philosophers or for there, but I think my fundamental thesis is that the way to predict the future is to go back to asking hard philosophical questions. And that way, I think you have a better grip of how future is going to be, how future systems are going to be. So that's how I kind of approach this. Yeah.
Oh, that's something we certainly try to do here on the Earthlings 2.0. I love to get into deep philosophical conversations about the past and the future. And you're right, it does help you, it helps your brain extrapolate these connections that aren't linear and that might not dawn on you if you were only focused on the practicality of a topic. I'm curious, related to this concept of treating nature like a machine or an organism. What are some processes or technologies that farmers are either implementing now or that's coming online that they could implement that would fall into these two buckets? Like as an example, I feel like regenerative agriculture would fall more into treating nature like an organism because you're sort of supporting the soil.
Yeah. See, for instance, I'll just think of a technology that's coming on top of my mind right now, right? For instance, you could say that, I'll maybe present one problem and see how we can look at it from two different ways, right? So now you want to identify what stresses farm plants are going through, okay? Now there are two that you want to identify what is the plant, because you're trying to grow a plant and the plant is also responding to it. The plant responds in different ways. The plant is also responding. It responds to the stress. It responds to the environment, and so there's a continuous dialogue that's going on now. Now, how do you figure out this dialogue? One way is to really see how the leaves are curling in, right? If the leaves don't get enough sunlight or they start to curl in like this, right? So one way is to observe this. Now that is one way of doing it. But of course, you can't do this at scale. You don't have the eyes to kind of see whether each plant, how it's responding individually, especially if you're doing it in a massive landscape. So now what people did was, there's a company called Inner Plant. I've written about it there. Now what they've done is they identified a sort of a fluorescent protein. It's called GFP. And this fluorescent protein, they try to insert it in the gene, and it doesn't propagate itself. It's a sort of sterile sort of protein there. So you insert that, and then you start to grow. You build a soybean trait on it, right? I'm of course I'm not a scientist, so I'm kind of explaining it in a very rudimentary way here. So, and when you sort of grow the soybean trait that way, it starts to the GFP starts to the fluorescent protein starts to emit signals that kind of show you how the plant is growing in. And when you sort of use a particular satellites and particular drones for it, it kind of gives you a very good picture of how the plant is responding and how it's growing. Now this is how an alternative way of sort of treating it like more from a machine, where you identify certain sensors inside the plant. Right? These are living sensors that are inside the plant that give you a sense of how the plant is responding to stress. Is the plant stressed? Does the plant need micronutrient? What kind of micronutrient you want? And lets farmers take better decisions at scale. Now this is a new technology there. This is again, this is sort of slowly growing up in US largely. But they want to grow this with soybean because we grow a lot of soybean in US there. So now they want to move this kind of technology to tomatoes and other plants as well. So this is an example of how do you identify stress? Do you observe directly? But you can't do that at scale. So then what ways can you identify how the plant is responding? So this is just one example that, yeah.
does really feel like we're at sort of this crossroads within the industry of sort of a- as it's attempting to rediscover itself in a way, and what's been working, what's not working, and how do we, improve it for the future, knowing that a warmer planet means lower yields, higher chances of pests and disease, lower perhaps in certain regions, less predictable water. And so I'm curious from your perspective with all the writing that you do, what advice would you have for farmers and agricultural stakeholders as they prepare for the future?
I'm no I'm no expert to give advice to farmers here. Farmers are the ones who are far more. I'm actually learning more from farmers. Uh, we are in this kind of transition phase where farmers are realizing that we have to maybe do this transition towards better systems that work for us, that work for our families, that work for our health, that work for our children, and also it does also makes economic sense. So I think today farmers, if you ask to a farmer, most an Indian farmer, you talk to them, he'll say that I have this small patch of land which is where I grow organically or region, and I have the remaining part of the land that I grow for the market. This is a classic pattern you would see in most of the Indian farmers right now, right? Because they're aware of the the risk and the challenges with respect to growing it in a very with a lot of synthetic chemicals. So they are aware of it, but at the same time, the market kind of rewards in a certain efficiency there.
And we've talked about a lot of things here. So what is something that you think people really ought to remember about the future of agriculture as we go in, as we continue in on this timeline?
If you allow me to be slightly more political here, right? We are facing a crisis where, at one end, urban consumers are becoming more and more unhealthy, because at the end of the day, like we pay for cheap food in almost four ways. We pay for the cheap food in one way by what we pay in the cash counter, by the tax we pay. We also pay by the kind of the price we allow our children to take forward in terms of the way they are carrying it forward, and we also pay by the health bills that we all pay, right? But at the end of the day, we are all humans. They are producing food, and they need to be healthy, and they need to live economic prosperous life for them to produce healthy food for us, right? So how well we can bridge these two worlds by giving the right set of incentives that kind of that takes care of our health, and make sure that the farmers are well rewarded for that. I think that is where we need to bridge these two worlds much more closer here. I don't think we can afford to carve this chasm between this rural world and the urban world here. Yeah.
What you're saying reminds me of the concept you talked about, rice having lower nutrients today than maybe 100 years ago. And then wheat has a dramatically higher levels of gluten in it. And this is because, the industrial buyers of wheat needed a lot of gluten to make a lot of, yummy breads and pastas and things like this. But the human body didn't evolve to digest that much gluten. And I think that's why you have a lot of people having more gluten sensitivities now than before. You could say the same thing about soy. Soybeans are great to eat. You make tofu, and the concentration of soy is so high, your body has to leach its own nutrients, just and minerals, just to digest it. Right. So there's this. It's like the industrial aspects of farming have then created these health effects that we're now paying for, and we'd probably all be better off if we could just eat more real food. But then real food has a shelf life, right? So now it's more expensive and it's not going to last as long. So there's the incentive to create foods that have a longer shelf life, which means they have lower nutrients and last on the, it's just, it seems it all, there seems to be this conflict between what what humans need in terms of food and what the industrial farming um, infrastructure and apparatus is encouraged to grow for its own business purposes.
Yeah, it's a complex problem.
And so now we're at this place where we're sort of contemplating, like you said, like economies of scale not really working anymore. Maybe it's economies of scope, or maybe it's something different, because I think we're coming to a realization that it's your agriculture is operating in a closed system. We're in an ecosystem, and there is and you can't just force something into existence. You have to work alongside nature to create the thing that you're looking for, while also still being able to provide a livelihood for yourself. So it's, like you said, a very complex problem.
See, we are also have to rethink what markets mean. When I came to US, I remember there were a lot of local farmer markets there. So farmer markets is a good way to kind of make it things more local, right? See, because the body and one of the fundamental paradigms of biology is that atoms are local, right? If the plant wants to grow its leaf, it's going to extract from the locally there. It's not going to source in from the most farthest, the most cost-effective place.
Okay, yes, it's a great analogy. Continue.
Yeah, so the plant is going to, if it's going to produce a leaf that's needed, it's going to source from the local, right? And likewise for our bodies and for our, you were talking about gluten sensitivity, right? Like we developed wheat varieties for the industry, and we ended up using, imagine where you are designing something for somebody else and you ending up using them, right? We would call that a user experience mismatch, and that's what we've been doing that for wheat for a very, very long time, right? So now what does it make? Like in India, we are right now, we're going back to a lot of heirloom and old native varieties there, which obviously don't have a large shelf life. So then the question comes is, now how do you make sure that, they retain the kind of quality and go to the markets? So we have to really rethink a lot of things here in terms of packaging, in terms of transport, logistics, in terms of what food you should eat there, right? Do I eat the guacamole that has traveled all the way from Africa, or do I eat or what do I eat there, right? I'm not taking any sides here. These are a lot of hard questions that we need to be pondering over when it comes to food and the kind of choices we want to make for our bodies.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vinky. This has been really fascinating. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about, or the question you thought I'd ask that I didn't?
No, I think we covered there. I think, I was very intrigued by the word Earthlings, right? Because yesterday I was reading this, I was listening to this letter written, I think letter that was performed by Benedict Cumberbatch, of how we ought to be sorry. Like the letter is read out by a father to his son, saying that he's sorry that we couldn't crack the climate change problem. And I think it's a question. I have a 6-year-old son, and I'm sure that one day he's going to wake up and say, "Why did you guys really mess up this planet in such ways?" Right? And I'm aware that he's going to confront me with that question and ask me, "And what do you do about it?" Right? And it's a question that, I engage. I take him to a lot of my farms, doing my farm visits. I take him to farms and I ask him questions, and I help him explore what does it mean to, when I take him to the supermarket, he explores the food choices and he explores what is there inside in a label. So I think as Earthlings, what is our responsibility and what are we doing about the kind of systems that we built around, right? And I think our children are going to pay a bigger price than us. I'm 39. Maybe I might go until 80s or 85. I don't know. But then my son he's 6 now. He's going to spend a much more longer period on Earth, dealing with the effects of what we have done, right? So I think there is a humongous responsibility as Earthlings and I think one of the and given that agriculture constitutes almost 30% of climate change, and it's one of the massive drivers and also victim of, right? Because in terms of the choices we make and the trade-offs we make, we bear it to our bodies. So I think it's an important responsibility for all of us to look at hard questions of what kind of food we want to put into our bodies, and what kind of food we want to grow, and what kind of ways can we grow them without harming the planet. So I think while we can, while to a large extent the effects of climate change I don't think are going to be reversed, and we've already passed that boat. We can say more emotionally sorry to our children, but the least we can do is right now design to the best extent we can, and so ensuring that they get at least good food to eat. Yeah.
I think it was Kurt Vonnegut that said, we're the only species, will go down in history as a species that refused to save itself because it wasn't economically cost effective. And the reason I named it Earthlings is Earthlings 2.0 is because we are all one people basically on a starship. It just happens to be a planet. And if you were on a generation ship out there in space, you would be thinking very carefully about the decisions that you are making to ensure that generations could live after you on a starship. That would be paramount to your decision making. Well, it's no different for this planet, but people don't see it that way. They have this short-term thinking.
I think that's where probably, I tend to think of the role of culture. Agriculture is the only domain where it carries a culture in its belly, right? And I think there's something else that there where as societies, some of the ways we look at the long term aspects of the society, right? They were encoded in the culture, right, in the practices that we do, and in the way that I mean, again, I'm not going back to some kind of old time nostalgia here, but there were always certain elements in the culture that kind of made sure that we understand that we are in a planetary spaceship. So I think it's very, very important for us to kind of ponder over that. What kind of culture are we creating in our midst that could probably remind us of that role, because the world around us is all short life, right? I mean, the amount of content that gets generated, the amount of movies that get generated, when there's so much of abundance and of all the things that are of inconsequential things there, right? We also tend to get assume that we are in this for short ride. Why not make the best of it and then go, right? It makes us forget that. But whereas, for instance, if we go back to old ruins or old temples that are built like more than 400, 500 years, they remind you that, yeah, these are going to last for a generation.
Well, but yeah, at the end of the day, you're in a closed loop system, and you can only extract from that system for so long before, like you said, economies of scale. Eventually, there's always a trade off that nature brings to you with economies of scale, and I think now I think climate change is just one factor globally that is encouraging Earthlings to rethink how they've been operating, which I think is a good thing. My concern is that we're just a little too slow on the uptake, and our economic structures and policy structures are not able to move fast enough to adjust to something that seems so far into the future, even though it's starting to happen today.
Yeah, true. I think, and that's where we are now starting to kind of figure out the answers, and there's slightly more better, bigger urgency now, at least in compared to the past. And hopefully we do a better job. Or else we have to say to our kids, "Sorry, I screwed up."
Earthlings. I hope you were taking some notes in that conversation because there's a lot of good information in there. This idea of economies of scale versus economies of scope, treating nature like an organism versus a machine, and really how we're going to go about evolving agriculture in the future. I do think that there's something to be said for a forcing function of climate change, even though it's a very scary and existential threat. It is really encouraging us to rethink how we do things and understand that we are operating in a closed ecosystem. So the changes that we make to it can come to haunt us later on down the line. So feel free to subscribe to the Agribusiness Matters newsletter. You will not be disappointed. Even the free version has a lot of good information and insights. So we'll leave a link for that in our show notes. Our faith in humanity is restored this week by several policymakers in India. Prime Minister Modi, the former Minister of Railways, the former chairman of the Railway Board. These leaders were all instrumental in achieving the electrification of nearly all of India's railways and on schedule, which is what you want with your trains, right? On time. India's railway system has electrified over 63,000 route kilometers, which is over 96% of its broad gauge network. Under Moody's vision, the pace was accelerated significantly in 2017, and each year after that, more track was laid down than the previous year. Thank you, Wikipedia, for that information. This monumental achievement not only reduces the railway's carbon footprint, but it also sets a global example for sustainable infrastructure. We commend these leaders for demonstrating for us that true climate leadership looks like getting the job done and having influence where you can. You're the head of the railway system, electrify the railways. That's what we want to encourage all of us Earthlings to do. Use your influence where you can to create the change that we all want to see on this beautiful blue-green space flower that we call home.